For 28 years, my family treated my nursing degree like a polite, somewhat embarrassing hobby. To them, I was merely a glorified bedpan cleaner. They laughed at my scrubs and mocked my salary until the night my mother started turning blue at her pristine dining table, and the television behind her suddenly broadcasted exactly what just a nurse is actually capable of. If you ever want to understand the hierarchy of the Hastings family, all you have to do is look at the seating arrangement at my mother's mahogany dining table. At the head sat my father, Emerson, a retired corporate judge whose silence was as imposing as his gavel used to be. To his immediate right was my mother, Barbara, a woman whose entire existence revolved around the country club, charity galas, and ensuring everyone in her orbit met her impossible standards of societal success. Next to her sat the golden child, my older sister Vanessa, a senior partner at a cutthroat downtown Toronto law firm by the age of 32. Beside Vanessa sat her equally insufferable fiancé, Richard Kensington, an investment banker whose family had so much old money they practically sweat dividends. And then, down at the far end of the table, usually wedged near the kitchen swinging door so I could easily fetch more ice or clear the salad plates, was me, Chloe, the disappointment. "I just don't understand why you couldn't have gone to medical school, Chloe," my mother sighed, swirling her Pinot Noir during our family's obligatory Sunday dinner. It was a conversation we had at least once a month, like clockwork. "You had the grades in high school. Now look at you. 28 years old, working rotating shifts, wiping up. God knows what. It's unseemly." "I'm an emergency room trauma nurse, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I was used to this. I don't just wipe things up, I help keep people alive. It's a highly specialized field." Richard chuckled, a short, breathy sound of pure condescension. He reached over and adjusted his Rolex. "Come on, Chloe, you follow doctor's orders. You're like the paralegals at Vanessa's firm. Essential for the paperwork, sure, but you aren't the ones arguing the case. Actually, Richard, in a trauma bay, nurses are the ones running the primary assessments, securing airways, and administering life-saving drugs before the attending physician even steps fully into the room," I said, my knuckles turning white around my fork. Vanessa rolled her eyes, her perfect blowout catching the light of the chandelier. "Please don't use the word airways at the dinner table, Chloe. We're eating duck confit. No one wants to hear about your bodily fluids and hospital grossness. It's just low-brow." My father finally chimed in, not to defend me, but to keep the peace. Now, let's not upset your mother. Chloe's job is honest work, even if it isn't lucrative. Though, speaking of lucrative, Richard, how is the merger proceeding?" Just like that, I was dismissed. Erased. This was the agonizing reality of my life. I had graduated at the top of my nursing class at McGill University. I held advanced certifications in trauma and critical care. My colleagues at Toronto General Hospital respected me, relied on me, and trusted me with the lives of their patients. But to the Hastings family, I was a tragic failure. Because my job didn't come with a corner office, a corporate expense account, or a six-figure bonus, it was entirely devoid of value. The emotional toll of this constant belittling was heavier than any 12-hour shift I'd ever worked. Every time I walked into my mother's sprawling Rosedale mansion, I was immediately stripped of my professional identity and reduced to the family servant. If someone spilled wine, everyone looked at me. When the caterers for Vanessa's engagement party arrived, my mother instructed me to wait in the kitchen with them to ensure the hors d'oeuvres were plated correctly, explicitly telling me not to mingle because my off-the-rack dress clashed with the aesthetic. I took it. I swallowed the bile and the tears because, despite their toxicity, they were my family. I naively hoped that one day they would see me. Really see me. I hoped they would understand that the exhaustion in my eyes wasn't from a lack of ambition, but from the crushing weight of holding dying strangers' hands, of doing CPR until my ribs bruised, of fighting the Grim Reaper on a daily basis. But my breaking point was quietly approaching. It began brewing on the night of Vanessa's bridal shower rehearsal, a month before the infamous dinner that would change everything. "Chloe, I need you to go pick up the dry cleaning tomorrow morning before you come over to help set up. Vanessa texted me at 11:00 p.m. I was currently on my break in the hospital staff room, eating a cold sandwich after a brutal multi-trauma car crash had flooded our ER. I can't, Ness, I texted back. I'm on a 1-2 hour night shift. I won't get off until 7 a.m., and I have to sleep. Can Richard do it? Her reply was instantaneous. Richard is closing a deal. His time is actually money. What do you even do on night shifts anyway? Don't the patients just sleep? Just grab a coffee and get the dresses. Stop being so dramatic. I stared at the screen, a nurse's intuition telling me it was useless to argue. The sheer, blinding ignorance of my sister's worldview made my chest ache. I didn't reply. I just put my phone in my locker, splashed cold water on my face, and walked back out into the chaos of the ER, where at least my bleeding heart had a purpose. I had no idea that the universe was about to violently collide my two worlds together. 2 weeks later, Toronto experienced one of the worst flash freezes in its history. The roads turned to black ice in a matter of minutes. I was just finishing a grueling day shift, slipping out of my scrubs in the locker room, when the hospital's overhead PA system crackled to life with the dreaded sound of the mass casualty alarm. Code Orange. All available ER and trauma personnel report to the emergency bays immediately. Mass casualty incident. Code Orange. I didn't even hesitate. I threw my scrubs back on, tied my hair into a messy bun, and sprinted back down the hall. The charge nurse, Brenda, a grizzled veteran who rarely showed emotion, looked pale as I approached the desk. Massive pileup on the 401, she barked, pointing at the dispatch monitors. A transport truck jackknifed into a retaining wall, and about 20 cars slammed into it. EMS is overwhelmed. We're taking the highest acuity traumas. I was just clocking out, but I'm in, I said, grabbing a fresh pair of gloves and a trauma apron. Glad to hear it, Hastings. We need an advanced airway team to deploy with the flight medics to the scene. The highway is a parking lot. Ambulances can't get deep into the wreckage. They need to stabilize patients in the crushed vehicles before extrication. You're our best trauma nurse. Go with Dr. Hayes. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my training overrode the fear. 10 minutes later, Dr. Simon Hayes and I were in the back of an orange medevac helicopter roaring over the gridlocked city. When we looked down at the highway, it looked like a war zone. Mangled steel, shattered glass, and flashing red and blue lights stretched for miles. The helicopter touched down on a cleared section of the highway. The wind was howling, biting into my skin, but the adrenaline kept me warm. We hit the ground running, carrying heavy jump bags filled with emergency meds, intubation kits, and trauma supplies. A frantic firefighter grabbed my arm as soon as we cleared the rotor wash. "We've got a critical one trapped in a sedan under the transport's trailer," he shouted over the noise. "Driver is unconscious, agonal breathing. We can't get the roof off for at least another 20 minutes. He won't last." "Show me," I yelled back. Simon and I crawled on our stomachs across the icy asphalt, sliding under the massive shadow of the transport truck to reach the crushed silver sedan. The space was incredibly tight. Simon, who was a foot taller and significantly broader than me, couldn't maneuver his shoulders through the smashed window to reach the driver. "Chloe, I can't get the angle," Simon grunted, his face red with effort. "He's losing his airway. His jaw is locked. Let me in," I demanded. I squeezed through the jagged remnants of the passenger window, ignoring the sharp shards of glass that sliced through my uniform and bit into my forearm. The smell of leaking gasoline and copper blood was overwhelming. The driver, a young man no older than 20, was pinned by the steering wheel. His face was a mess of lacerations, and he was taking ragged, gasping breaths. "I'm in," I yelled back to Simon, who was passing me the equipment through the window. "GCS is 3. I need to intubate now or he's going to code." "Do it, Hastings. I've got your back," Simon said. Cramped in the twisted metal, with ice water dripping onto my neck and the agonizing sound of grinding steel all around me, I went to work. My hands were perfectly steady. I administered the paralytic and induction agents Simon handed me. I grabbed the laryngoscope, tilted the young man's bloody chin, and searched for his vocal cords in the dark, chaotic mess of his airway. "Come on, stay with me," I muttered. I found the cords, slid the endotracheal tube in flawlessly, and secured it. I started bagging him, manually forcing oxygen into his failing lungs. "Tube is in. Good chest rise." For the next 45 minutes, I stayed trapped in that car with the young man, maintaining his airway and administering fluids, while the fire department quite literally tore the car apart around us using the jaws of life. I was covered in his blood, engine oil, and soot. My muscles screamed in agony from being contorted in the cramped space, but I didn't stop bagging. I didn't let him die. When they finally ripped the roof off and pulled us both out, a cheer erupted from the surrounding first responders. As we loaded the stabilized patient onto a stretcher, I wiped my forehead with the back of my arm, smearing a thick streak of grease and blood across my face. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a bright light and a large camera. A reporter from CBC News, who had been broadcasting live from the highway overpass, had managed to get down to the front lines. The cameraman had his lens pointed directly at me as I shouted hand over vitals to the flight paramedics. I didn't care. I was too focused on keeping my patient alive. We flew back to the hospital, and I spent another 6 hours in the OR and trauma bays, fighting for the lives of the pile-up victims. By the time I finally washed the blood off my arms and changed into my civilian clothes, it was 9:00 a.m. the next day. I had been awake for 26 hours. I felt like I had been hit by the transport truck myself. I pulled my phone out of my locker and saw 14 unread messages. My heart leapt into my throat, thinking maybe my family had seen the news. Maybe they were worried sick because they knew I worked at the hospital receiving the victims. I opened the text thread from my mother. "Barbara. Chloe, reminder that Vanessa's pre-wedding dinner with Richard's parents is tonight at 7 sharp. Barbara, do not be late. The Kensingtons are very punctual. Vanessa, did you pick up my dry cleaning yet? Barbara, Chloe, answer your phone. It is incredibly rude to ignore us. Vanessa, she's probably sleeping. Must be nice to just sit around all night and nap at a hospital. Barbara, if you forget the dry cleaning, don't bother coming tonight. This dinner has to be perfect." There was no mention of the massive tragedy that had brought the city to a standstill. No question of whether I was safe, overwhelmed, or traumatized. Just the dry cleaning. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. I looked at myself in the locker room mirror. I had dark, bruised bags under my eyes. There was a tiny cut on my cheek from the windshield glass, and my hands were still slightly trembling from the adrenaline crash. I had literally pulled a dying man back from the brink of the abyss with my bare hands, and my family thought I was taking a nap. I typed a reply with numb fingers. "I will bring the dry cleaning. See you at 7. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner would be the stage for the most spectacular, terrifying, and ultimately vindicating moment of my entire life. Karma was brewing, and it was about to be served colder than the black ice on the 401. The Hastings residence in Rosedale was a fortress of limestone and manicured hedges, a place designed to intimidate rather than welcome. When I dragged my exhausted body up the sweeping driveway at 6:45 p.m., the heavy garment bag containing Vanessa's dry-cleaned rehearsal dresses felt like it weighed 50 pounds. My muscles still burned from the cramped, terrifying hours spent inside that mangled sedan on the 401. I had managed exactly 3 hours of restless, nightmare-plagued sleep before my alarm had mercilessly ordered me back into the world of the living. I had showered twice, trying to scrub the phantom scent of iron, gasoline, and tragedy from my skin, but it lingered in my sinuses like a curse. I pushed open the heavy oak front door and was immediately hit by the scent of expensive lavender diffusers and roasting meat. The foyer was immaculate, the marble floors gleaming under the crystal chandelier. "You're late." Vanessa's voice clipped through the air before I even had my coat off. She emerged from the sitting room, draped in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She didn't look at my face. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the plastic-wrapped garments in my hand. And you wrinkled the bag. Honestly, Chloe, it's one simple task. Hand them here. I hit traffic, I murmured, my voice raspy. I didn't have the energy to explain that the city was still paralyzed by the morning's mass casualty event. I simply handed over the dresses. Well, hurry up and make yourself presentable, she ordered, turning on her heel. The Kensingtons are already in the parlor having scotch with Dad. And please, try not to bring up any depressing hospital stories tonight. Eleanor has a very delicate stomach. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood, nodded, and made my way to the downstairs powder room. I stared at my reflection in the gold leaf mirror. Despite the layers of concealer I had hurriedly applied, the dark circles under my eyes looked like bruises. The small cut on my cheek from the shattered windshield was covered by a tiny bandage, which I knew my mother would undoubtedly interpret as a deliberate attempt to ruin the family aesthetic. I took a deep, shuddering breath, pasted on a vacant, polite smile, and walked into the lion's den. The dining room was a masterclass in ostentatious wealth. The long mahogany table was set with Barbara's prized Royal Doulton china, heavy silver cutlery, and crystal wine glasses that caught the light like diamonds. Seated around the table were my parents, Vanessa, Richard, and Richard's parents, Charles and Eleanor Kensington. Charles was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a tailored suit, and Eleanor possessed the kind of icy, unblinking stare that could freeze boiling water. I slipped into my designated seat at the far end of the table, offering a quiet greeting. "Ah, the nightingale arrives," Charles Kensington boomed, swirling his amber liquid. His tone was laced with a patronizing amusement that made my skin crawl. "Richard tells me you're still working in the trenches, Chloe. Toronto General, is it? Emptying the proverbial bedpans for the unwashed masses?" A hot spike of anger flared in my chest, but I maintained my polite smile. "I'm a trauma nurse in the emergency department, Mr. Kensington. I mostly deal with critical injuries and resuscitations. Bedpans are generally handled by the orderlies, though I'm not above patient care of any kind." Eleanor gave a delicate shudder, placing a hand over her pearl necklace. "Oh, how dreadful. I simply don't know how you can stand the smells, dear. Let alone the sort of people who end up in emergency rooms. Why on earth didn't you go into something civilized, like dermatology? Or better yet, administration?" "Someone has to do the dirty work, Mother," Richard chimed in, slicing into his appetizer. "Chloe's always had a martyr complex. It's sweet, really, if a bit misguided financially. Vanessa and I were just looking at property in the bridle path today. You really can't build a portfolio on a public sector salary." "Richard is absolutely right," my mother, Barbara, interjected, shooting me a warning glare from the head of the table. "We've always said Chloe lacks ambition. But let's change the subject. Emerson, dear, tell Charles about the Municipal Zoning Board's decision on that commercial plot." For the next 45 minutes, I sat in silence, mechanically pushing food around my plate. The conversation flowed around me, an endless, self-congratulatory river of stock portfolios, country club politics, and luxury car leases. I was invisible. I was merely a prop, the disappointing benchmark against which they could measure their own spectacular success. My mind kept drifting back to the young man in the crushed sedan. I wondered if he had made it out of surgery. I wondered if his mother knew he was in the ICU. The main course arrived, a thick, heavily seared veal chop, glazed in a rich, dark reduction. It looked incredibly tough. "This meat is woefully overcooked," Barbara complained, sawing at her veal with her silver knife. She took a large, stubborn bite, her face pinching in dissatisfaction. "I told the caterers medium rare. This is practically shoe leather." She stopped mid-sentence. At first, no one noticed. Charles was deep into a monologue about offshore tax havens, and Vanessa was nodding along dutifully. But my eyes, trained to constantly scan rooms for subtle physiological changes, locked onto my mother. Barbara's silver fork clattered loudly against the china plate. Both of her hands flew up, clutching violently at her own throat, the universal sign of choking. Her eyes, normally so composed and judging, were suddenly wide, blown out with absolute primal terror. She wasn't coughing. That was the first thing my clinical brain registered. A coughing patient has a partial airway obstruction. Air is still moving. But my mother was completely silent. It was a total airway occlusion. The large piece of tough, unchewed veal had lodged squarely in her trachea. "Barbara? Darling, whatever is the matter?" Emerson asked, pausing his wine glass halfway to his mouth. He looked mildly annoyed by the interruption. My mother tried to inhale, but only a horrifying, high-pitched squeak escaped her lips. Her face, previously pale with expensive cosmetics, was rapidly flushing a deep, angry red. Is she all right?" Eleanor Kensington asked, her voice trembling slightly. She leaned away from the table as if choking were contagious. "Mom?" Vanessa said, annoyance quickly morphing into panic. "Mom, stop messing around. Breathe." But she couldn't. The red flush on Barbara's face was already deepening into a terrifying, dusky purple. Cyanosis. Her blood was rapidly losing oxygen, and her brain was suffocating. She stood up abruptly, her chair tipping over backward with a loud crash that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She stumbled sideways, knocking over her crystal wine glass. The dark red Pinot Noir bled across the pristine white linen tablecloth like a harbinger of death. Complete chaos erupted. "Do something!" Vanessa shrieked, jumping out of her chair, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. Richard, the titan of Wall Street, the man whose time was money, physically backed away, his face pale, entirely paralyzed by the sudden insertion of raw mortality into his sterile world. Emerson was fumbling wildly in his jacket pockets for his reading glasses, screaming at someone, anyone, to find his cell phone. "Someone call an ambulance!" Charles Kensington yelled, grasping his napkin. They were helpless. With all their millions, their degrees, their influence, and their devastating arrogance, they were completely, utterly useless as the matriarch of their family choked to death right in front of them. My exhaustion vanished, replaced instantly by the icy, crystal-clear focus of a trauma bay. The belittled, invisible daughter disappeared. The emergency room trauma nurse took the wheel. There was no time to explain, only to act. I rushed forward as my mother collapsed, her skin turning a frightening shade of purple. Every second mattered. Without oxygen, the brain begins to fail within minutes. By the time help arrived, it would be too late. I caught her just before she fell and pulled her upright, positioning my hands precisely above her abdomen. There was no room for hesitation. The first thrust was strong, controlled, but nothing happened. Her body sagged, growing heavier in my arms. Panic rose around me, voices shouting, accusing, but I shut them out. "Call 911. I ordered, focusing only on the task. I adjusted my grip and drove a second, more powerful thrust upward. A sharp crack echoed, bone giving way, but in that same instant, the blockage dislodged. The piece of food shot free, and my mother collapsed forward, gasping violently as air finally returned to her lungs. The room fell silent, except for her ragged breathing. Color slowly returned to her face as she clung to life. I checked her pulse, steady but racing, and gave clear instructions for the paramedics on the way. No one spoke. They simply stared. Then, from the adjoining room, the television broke the silence. News footage filled the screen, chaotic scenes from a massive highway accident. And there I was, covered in blood, pulling a victim from wreckage, commanding the scene with precision and urgency. A doctor's voice followed, praising the unnamed nurse who had saved a life against impossible odds. The room shifted. The version of me they had always believed in, the quiet, insignificant daughter, was gone. In its place stood someone they no longer recognized. The wail of the approaching ambulance sirens finally broke the heavy, suffocating silence in the dining room. Within moments, the heavy oak front door swung open, and two advanced care paramedics rushed in with their jump bags and cardiac monitor. I knew them both. It was Gary and Dave from Station 42. "Where's the patient?" Gary barked, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me, still kneeling beside my mother. He stopped dead in his tracks, blinking in shock. "Hastings? What the hell are you doing here? Didn't we just leave you at the landing zone 6 hours ago?" Family dinner, Gary, I said, my voice deadpan as I stood up, my knees cracking. Patient is a 61-year-old female. Total airway occlusion caused by a foreign body, a piece of unchewed meat. I delivered 2 abdominal thrusts. The obstruction is cleared, but I heard a distinct crack on the second thrust. Suspect a fractured right lateral rib. She experienced roughly 90 seconds of cyanosis and partial loss of consciousness before the airway was secured. She's tachycardic but breathing spontaneously on room air. Gary let out a low whistle, immediately dropping to his knees to apply a pulse oximeter to my mother's finger. Textbook handover, Hastings. As always. He looked at my mother, who was still trembling on the Persian rug. You're a very lucky woman, ma'am. If your daughter hadn't been here, or if she hesitated for even a minute, you wouldn't be breathing right now. My mother didn't say a word. She just stared at me, tears cutting clean tracks through her expensive foundation. Emerson finally found his voice. We should go to the hospital. Which hospital are you taking her? Toronto General, Dave replied, strapping a blood pressure cuff to Barbara's arm. Hastings' home turf. I rode in the back of the ambulance with my mother, holding her cold, manicured hand while she received high-flow oxygen. For the first time in my 28 years of life, she looked at me not with disappointment, but with a raw, unfiltered reverence. The power dynamic of our entire relationship had been permanently inverted in the span of 3 minutes. When we arrived at the emergency department, the sheer scale of the respect I commanded in my professional life was laid bare for my family to see. Emerson, Vanessa, and Richard had followed in Emerson's Mercedes and walked into the bustling ER waiting room just as the triage nurses rushed out to meet our stretcher. "Chloe, we saw the news!" Brenda, the hardened charge nurse, yelled, running over and throwing her arms around me, completely ignoring protocol. "You're a legend, Hastings. The trauma bay is buzzing. Dr. Hayes hasn't shut up about you." Doctors I had worked with for years gave me clapping ovations as I walked my mother back to an acute care bay. My father and sister trailed behind me like lost children, completely out of their element. They watched in stunned silence as I effortlessly interpreted my mother's EKG for the attending physician, requested specific blood panels, and smoothly coordinated her pain management for the broken rib. I wasn't fetching ice. I was dictating medical care. "She's going to be fine, doctor," Hayes said an hour later, stepping into the bay and shaking my father's hand. "She needs rest. But I have to tell you, Mr. Hastings, your daughter is the finest trauma nurse this hospital has seen in a decade. She pulled off a miracle on the 401 today, and it sounds like she pulled off another one in your dining room." Emerson cleared his throat, looking down at his Italian leather shoes. Yes. Thank you, doctor. We are very proud of her." The words felt hollow, but they were a start. However, the universe wasn't finished with the Hastings and Kensington families. The hard karma I had quietly wished for over years of emotional abuse was already in motion, and it was about to hit with the destructive force of a freight train. The next morning, the city of Toronto woke up to a changed narrative. The shock of the 6-0 car pileup had transitioned into a furious demand for accountability. The Ministry of Transportation and the Ontario Provincial Police had been working through the night, investigating the mangled wreckage of the transport truck that had jackknifed and initiated the slaughter. I was asleep in my apartment, finally catching up on the rest I had been deprived of for 2 days, when my phone started vibrating violently off the nightstand. It was noon. I answered groggily. "Hello? Chloe, turn on the news. Turn on CBC right now." It was my father, and he sounded like he was having a panic attack. I grabbed my remote and flicked on the television. Ian Hanumansing was back on the screen, but this time, he wasn't talking about heroics. He was talking about corporate manslaughter. Investigators have confirmed that the transport truck responsible for yesterday's catastrophic pileup belongs to Orion Logistics, the anchor stated grimly. A preliminary inspection of the cab revealed that the truck's brakes were entirely degraded, and the tires were completely bald, a blatant violation of winter safety protocols. But the story goes much deeper. Sources within the dot confirm that Orion Logistics has a documented history of falsifying maintenance records to cut operational costs. A graphic appeared on the screen showing the corporate structure of Orion Logistics. Financial records show that Orion Logistics is in the final stages of a massive acquisition by Kensington Holdings, a deal orchestrated to finalize this week. Whistleblowers have come forward stating that executives at Kensington Holdings, along with their legal counsel at Hastings and Vance LLP, were made fully aware of these severe safety violations during the due diligence period, but actively buried the reports to ensure the multi-million-dollar merger went through before the end of the fiscal quarter. The remote slipped from my hand and clattered onto the hardwood floor. Hastings and Vance, LLP. Vanessa's firm. Kensington Holdings. Richard's family. My sister and her fiancé hadn't just been planning a wedding, they had been conspiring to hide the lethal negligence of a trucking company to secure their own massive financial bonuses. The very wealth they used to mock my public sector salary was built on the blood of the people I had been fighting to save on that frozen highway. Arrest warrants have been issued this morning, the broadcast continued. Richard Kensington, lead underwriter for the acquisition, and Vanessa Hastings, senior partner and lead counsel, have been taken into custody by the RCMP Financial Crimes Division, facing charges of criminal negligence causing death, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The footage cut to a live feed outside Vanessa's towering downtown office building. My jaw dropped as I watched my immaculate, untouchable older sister being escorted out of the revolving glass doors in handcuffs. Her designer blazer was rumpled, and she was aggressively shielding her face from the flashing cameras of the paparazzi. Right behind her was Richard, looking pale, pathetic, and terrified as an officer guided him into the back of an unmarked police cruiser. The young man I had pulled from the crushed sedan, the one who had almost died while I bagged his failing lungs in the dark, was the victim of their greed. The fallout was absolute and apocalyptic. The Rosedale royalty was dragged out of their limestone fortress and thrown into the merciless court of public opinion. Charles Kensington, attempting to save his own skin and his company's plunging stock, immediately publicly disowned Richard, claiming his son had acted as a rogue agent. Eleanor Kensington canceled the wedding via a cold, two-sentence press release. Vanessa was immediately stripped of her partnership at the law firm, her license suspended pending disbarment. The millions of dollars they had bragged about at the dinner table vanished overnight, seized by federal authorities or drained by exorbitant criminal defense retainers. The country club canceled my parents' membership, citing the distasteful nature of the public scandal. The friends who used to attend Barbara's charity galas stopped returning her calls. The superficial world they had built, the one that excluded me, collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. 3 months later, the dust had finally begun to settle. I walked into the Rosedale mansion on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The house felt different. The oppressive, judging atmosphere was gone, replaced by a heavy, humbling silence. The lavish caterers were nowhere to be seen. I found my mother in the kitchen. She was wearing a simple, inexpensive sweater, clumsily trying to chop carrots for a stew. She looked 10 years older, the stress of Vanessa's impending criminal trial having carved deep lines into her face. But as she looked up and saw me, her eyes softened with genuine warmth. "Chloe," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She walked over and hugged me. It wasn't the stiff, obligatory embrace of the past. She held on tightly, resting her chin on my shoulder. "You're off shift. You should be resting." "I'm okay, Mom," I said gently, pulling back. "How are you feeling? How's the rib?" "Healed." She smiled weakly. "A small price to pay." She looked down at the cutting board. "Your father is visiting Vanessa at the detention center today. I couldn't go. Not yet. I'm still so angry at her. At what she did. At what we all became." She looked back up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "I am so incredibly sorry, Chloe, for all of it. For every cruel word, every dismissed accomplishment, every time we made you feel small. We were entirely blinded by things that didn't matter. And when it came down to a matter of life and death, the only person with any real value in this family was you." I reached out and squeezed her hand. I didn't need to say I forgive you. The fact that I was standing there was forgiveness enough. Later that week, I stood on a stage at Rideau Hall in Ottawa. The Governor General of Canada pinned the EMS Exemplary Service Medal to the lapel of my dress uniform, the flash of cameras capturing the moment. My patient from the 401 pileup, now walking with a cane but very much alive, was sitting in the front row, cheering loudly. And in the second row, sitting quietly and looking at me with nothing but absolute, undivided pride, were Emerson and Barbara Hastings. They had finally realized that being just a nurse was the greatest honor their family had ever produced. In the end, the carefully curated illusion of the Rosedale elite shattered under the weight of its own arrogance. True value isn't measured by the balance in an offshore account or the label on a designer suit. It is measured by what you do when the world falls apart. They learned the hard way that when the final breath is on the line, nobody calls a corporate lawyer.